All right, so this is not a video I ever really planned on making. This is something that kind of came together after some recent inspiration after a trip to Yellowstone. I happened to be out there for other reasons and was driving right by the 9 Mile Hole area and decided to stop by and pay homage to Forrest's little spot. I didn't actually cross the river, I just went out to 9 Mile Hole and stood at Fenn Rock and just kind of reflected on that part of my life. I mean, it was a very significant part of my life from the time I started looking in 2018 until it was found in 2020, and then all the chaos of the aftermath of all that. But you know, it's now been almost 5 years since this all ended, and really the most of the action happened in that first 2 or 3 years after the find, and things have kind of cooled down, and I think most of us have moved on with our lives, and so have I. Up until this visit to 9 Mile Hole kind of got my mind spinning in Forrest Fenn mode again. And I had a couple of, more than anything, a couple of my frustrations or doubts about the narrative we've received in the aftermath kind of resurfaced a little bit. And specifically in regards to my concerns about the lack of precision that the community solve that has been reverse engineered from the location gives us, and also just some of the things Jack said about the blaze specifically. Now, this isn't a conspiracy theory video. I 100% subscribe to the notion that the chest was found at 9 Mile Hole, just like Jack. All the court documents suggest that Jack did, and all the evidence that support that, including finding the log that was in the picture of the chest find. And, I believe that 100% that it was found there. So don't come here for a conspiracy. But really what I wanted to get into is, first of all, I want to go over what has been the consensus solved to explain the location we got. And then a couple revisions I want to make to that. And then I want to introduce an idea that I just came up with due to some of the hints in the book and some of the things I thought about this last weekend. That I think might give us a lot more precision and make a lot more sense out of the solve Forrest intended, and make it a lot more, in my opinion, satisfying. I think so many of us, as we became so invested in this, while we knew we might not be the finder, we believed that we would get an answer at the end of the day that would be satisfying enough to quench our thirst for whatever it was that Forrest intended. So just to go over it briefly, the proposed solve, it's essentially that Warm Water's halt was Madison Junction, the canyon down was Madison Canyon, the home of Brown was some combination of 9 Mile Hole, where brown trout live, or Fenn Rock itself, where you saw Marvin Fenn in the picture in front of Fenn Rock holding the brown trout. No place for the meek is generally considered like crossing the river or entering the forest. The end is ever drawing nigh is just kind of a sign that you're close. No paddle up your creek, heavy loads and water high is sort of a reference to the boulders and the debris in the water. Some people have said that they say that that's referring to the creek that enters 9 Mile Hole just upstream of the river there. And then lastly, the blaze is apparently something that was on a tree next to the chest that was destroyed at some point from the time Forrest hit it to the time Jack found it. So I'm going to bring up a few problems with the solve. Like I already kind of discussed, the lack of precision. I mean, these are some very vague instructions that take us to a very general area, and you have to ask yourself, is that really what Forrest intended? Maybe he did. Maybe Forrest just wanted this to be this thing that lasts for hundreds of years, so he kept it as ambiguous as possible and stuck the chest in the ground so it's even harder to find. What's the blaze? Because Jack, even though he said the blaze was destroyed beyond recognition, he never came out and said what it was. He never came out and said, well, it was a lightning scar on the tree or it was a carving on the tree. He just said, oh, it was destroyed. And it makes you wonder, does Jack even know what the blaze was? If he's saying it's destroyed beyond recognition, I'm assuming that means he didn't recognize it. He said himself that he found the chest before even finding a blaze. So was there a blaze where Jack said it was? Or is it possible Jack is maybe telling a little fib? We know that Jack was highly invested in protecting the location, And if saying what the blaze was were to compromise the secrecy of the location, he might be compelled to make up a story about the blaze being destroyed. And I wouldn't blame him for that given the circumstances. Additional things to consider, and we'll get to these as we go on through the presentation, but what does quickly down mean? I think the general consensus has always been that quickly down means to look at your feet when you arrive at the blaze, but I think there might be other ways to interpret that. Another question, what is the it in the poem? You begin it where warm waters halt, and you take it in the canyon down. I haven't heard an explanation for that. We just kind of gloss over that because we don't know. And then lastly, what does put in mean? Because there are when you look up put in the dictionary, there's a few different interpretations of it. Some people have suggested it's where you get in the water. I think you could probably say it's where you park. And there's a couple other ways to interpret that word as well. So what I'm going to propose is basically a 2-layer solve. And the first layer is going to look an awful lot like the one I just went over with you, with a couple little revisions. And then the second layer is going to be what allows us to do something totally different and imaginative that, in the end, creates a lot more precision for the final spot and makes true statements by Forrest that following the clues would take you right to the chest. He didn't say, yeah, following the clues, it'll get you there, then you have to, tear up the entire forest to find it. He made it pretty clear that solving the poem would take you right to the spot. So keep that in mind. And then, like I said, I think I can tell you what the word it means in this poem with this extra layer. So let's go to the revised layer 1. It's essentially the same with a couple little tweaks. So Warm Waters Halt is still Madison Junction. The canyon down is still Madison Canyon. Put in below the home of Brown, it still works as 9 Mile Hole, but I'm going to suggest, or I'm going to put forth the idea that Mount Haynes might also be that too. If you look at this screenshot of a map here, you have 9 Mile Hole at the circle at the top, and then you have Mount Haynes in the circle in the bottom. As you can see, 9 Mile Hole is located right below Mount Haynes. So why would I say Mount Haynes is the home of Brown? Well, let's go to a couple of quotes from the book. There was one on page 27 in The Thrill of the Chase. Fortunately, I was the only one in the class who knew that trick, the sliding, I mean. And even though that rusty old iron thing marked the tail of my britches up pretty good with a heavy brown color, it was worth it. So he's talking about going out the fire escape in Spanish class, down the slide, it gets his butt all brown, right? So trying to make some kind of comparison, maybe a hint at the home of Brown, I don't know. But just to be safe, this is another page in the book, page 21, but just to be safe, my mother always told me to wear clean underwear in case there was an accident. So at least a couple references in the book that might hint at Mount Haynes or Haynes underwear being the home of Brown. A couple of other evidences for that. One of the most famous quotes from Forrest in regards to how to find the treasure is he always said, look at the big picture. So F.J. Haynes, for whom Mount Haynes is named, was the first official photographer of Yellowstone. Back then they used large format photography, so that could be what he's saying with the big picture. He also worked for the Northern Pacific Railway, and he was also the photographer for them. And so, as we mentioned, that creek, the No Paddle Up Your Creek, it enters the Madison River just up creek or upstream of 9 Mile Hole. That goes right up to Mount Haynes. And so the heavy loads could also be a reference to the railroad connection there. And then the mountain was actually previously known as Mount Burley, who also worked for the Pacific Railroad. And burley is also a type of tobacco that when it's dried, it's brown. And so, once again, another possible second or third connection to the home of Brown. And then lastly, if you look on the map, the Mount Haynes overlook is actually 1 or 2 pullouts right before the 9 Mile Hole pullout. So once again, you're driving down the road, you see the sign for Mount Haynes overlook, and then 1 or 2 pullouts later, you're at the home of Brown. So below the home of Brown might be referring to Mount Haynes. And I think also 9 Mile Hole. I think some things have double meanings, right? So just to kind of go through the revised layer 1. So in layer 1, the second stanza from the warm waters halt to put in below the Homer Brown. It's giving us literal directions to 9 Mile Hole. Then the third stanza gives us more what I think of as observations of what you see at 9 Mile Hole, referring to the creek that you see, referring to the heavy loads and the water high. These aren't necessarily like, go here, go there, follow this, follow that. It's like, this is what you see. This is confirming that you have arrived at the correct location at the home of Brown, right? And then stanza 4, after we've made all these observations, stanza 4 then jumps into the past tense, and it says, it suggests we've already been wise and found the blaze, as if standing at the home of Brown, we should have already found the blaze. The blaze and the home of Brown might be in the same place. And so that's the question. And then, what I'm going to propose here is that the blaze is Fenn Rock. The problem with this theory is that if you look quickly down from Fenn Rock, like at your feet, obviously the chest wasn't there. We know that. But what if there's a different way to interpret quickly down? What if, you've arrived at the home of Brown, you've already found the blaze because you're at the blaze. You look quickly down on your map. And here I've given you a diagram or on the map of what that looks like. So you're at Fenn Rock, you look down at your map, quickly down from Fenn Rock. Well, that essentially points right at the chest. The heart here is my approximate, very close to the actual, if not the actual location of the chest, within 10 or 20 feet. So regardless if this is perfectly right or if it's a little off, either way, straight down from the blaze, quickly down from the blaze on a map, essentially points at the chest. So that's how you kind of rearrange your interpretation of the poem to make Fenn Rock work as the blaze. Now, why do we like Fenn Rock as the blaze? First of all, Forrest said quite a bit about the blaze. He answered a lot of questions about it. He said it was not feasible to remove the blaze. He said it would last hundreds, if not thousands of years. And he said it was certain it was still there. And yet all three of these statements were completely contradicted by Jack's account of the blaze. Jack saying that it was a blaze reportedly on a tree and it had been destroyed, right? And if that's the case, then either Forrest made these statements inaccurately, or Jack might not have known what the blaze was, or Jack was covering up the location. Because if Jack comes out and says, hey, Fenn Rock was the blaze, guess what? Now we know it was at 9 Mile Hole, and he was trying to prevent that. So there were multiple reasons why his account might not be truthful, and it's also possible that he didn't even know what it was. He himself says he found the chest without finding the blaze. So that's just my little rant on that and why I think Fenn Rock could be and probably is the blaze. So now we're going to go to a chapter in the book that's going to open up this whole idea of this second layer of the solve. I think it's the most important chapter in the book if this is in fact true. And I've highlighted a few quotes from this chapter. You can follow along. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the first 2 pages of this chapter because there's lots of good stuff in there and I don't want to skip over it and miss context. So just follow along the best you can. This is probably going to take me a couple of minutes to get through it, but I promise you I'll make it worth your while and make it all come together and make sense in the end. So, starting the chapter now, he says, one summer I found myself selling newspapers on the streets of West Yellowstone, Montana, the Montana Standard and the Billings Gazette. That was many years before the streets were paved, so the deep potholes on Canyon Street often were filled with water that was fair game for every car that bounced by. I think they competed to see which one could splash dirty water on the most people. I used to hide behind a tree and laugh. Anyway, I made a penny for every paper I sold, and it soon added up pretty good. But the sack my 80-pound body had to carry was so heavy, it was tiring to even think about it. One morning, I sat down to rest on the curb in front of Skaggs' grocery store when my boss just happened to drive by in his big, beautiful yellow Cadillac. He rolled the window down and yelled, "You're canned." That's all he said, and he drove away. There was nothing not to like about him because he was so suave and all. I didn't really know what canned meant, but guessed it must be something good because he was such a nice guy. When my mother told me I had been fired, I just stood there while the sun went behind a cloud. It killed me for sure. Getting fired, I mean. And all of a sudden, I saw my stupid ex-boss for what he really was. A fat, bald-headed hulk of a dirty name. I think his brain must have been constructed by the lowest bidder. Now I was not only out of a job, I also felt like I had fallen back to a place where there was no more back to fall back to. My mom said it was all right to cry, so we did that while standing under the lean-to where my father kept the Plymouth. Maybe that's why she helped me get a dishwashing job at the Totem Cafe. The job was a big deal, right there in the best part of town on the main drag. Well, it wasn't much of a drag, just 5 blocks. Anyway, it meant getting up at 4:45 a.m. on the job at 5 a.m., and 16 hours later, my shift ended and I was $8 richer. Each dish and pan had to be washed by hand, dipped in scalding water and dried. Woo! My hands were turned white and had deep canyons in them. What I really hated to wash were the giant kettles used for making brown gravy. The smell truly assaulted my sensitivities, and that's why I don't eat brown gravy anymore. But there was a wonderful old lady who also worked there. We called her Grandma, and she made cherry and apple pies that smelled pretty good. One day, during the lull between breakfast and lunch, I apprehended one of her hot pies, tiptoed out back behind a pine tree, and ate the whole thing. When Frosty caught me there, it was a severe scene. Well, he wasn't even the boss, he was just the manager, but he was pretty full of homage for his own person, and everyone around there knew it. One day Grandma took me in the frozen meat locker and said that when the owner gave Frosty an inch, he thought he'd become a ruler. Frosty, I mean. Anyway, Grandma told the guy she'd given me the dumb pie, and it was her right because she made it on her break. And I added that I had just borrowed it. The ruler thought both excuses were pretty lame, and he fired me right there in the dessert section of the cafe. So, the reason I share this chapter. So, a couple things to highlight. Forrest talks about selling newspapers in West Yellowstone. We know Forrest was very fond of West Yellowstone. He spent all of his summers there when he wasn't exploring the park. The deep potholes on Canyon Street were filled with water. So he talks about Canyon Street having potholes full of water. He talks about hiding behind a tree and laughing. He talks about the heavy sack that he carried down Canyon Street for his paper route. His mom got him a job at the Totem Cafe. He talked about his hands turning into white canyons in the scalding water when he was washing the dishes, and then the giant kettles used for making brown gravy. And then he talks about stealing the pie, going behind a pine tree, eating it, and then getting caught by Frosty. And then the grandma refers to Frosty as the ruler. So I want to take all of that, look at the picture of Frosty pointing at Forrest under a tree. Now, what does this kind of make you think of? Forrest holding a pie under the tree feels to me like it could be a representation of Forrest holding the treasure chest under a tree. Forrest likes to bring a lot of his stories up, and he talks about sitting under a tree. That's something that he liked to do. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to our map, and we're going to leave the presentation for a moment here. And what I'm going to do, without explaining why at first, I'm going to draw a line on this map. Okay, this is Madison Junction. So this is where the Firehole and the Gibbon rivers combine to form the Madison River. And we're going to draw a line right here. Okay, now you're going to draw this line to a somewhat unsuspecting place. And that line is going to take us to Madison Avenue and Canyon Street. Okay, so now when we back out, okay, so as you see, as we've looked at, this line goes right to the Forrest Fenn location. So here's the thing. Let's go back to Madison and Canyon. So go back to the poem, and it says, begin it where warm waters halt. What is it? What if it is a line? So begin our line where warm waters halt. Take our line in the canyon down, which in the literal following directions part of the solve, it's Madison Canyon. But I'm going to suggest we use our imaginations a little bit more here. The same solution, but different location. And here we have the junction of Madison Avenue, and Canyon Street. In other words, Madison Canyon. So we still took our line in the same canyon down as the literal solve, but now we've taken it to a place in West Yellowstone. Now, the Totem Cafe was located right here, right at the intersection of Madison and Canyon, right? This is where Frosty, the ruler, stood there and pointed to Forrest under the tree in that picture of him holding the pie, right? So you think about it that way. Now, we know that when we solved the poem literally and we went to 9 Mile Hole and we observed no place for the meek, the end is ever drawing nigh, there'll be no paddle up your creek, but heavy loads in water high. Now, if this solve is accurate, we should be able to do the same thing here. So now I'm actually going to splice into the presentation to bring up something I forgot to bring up. One of the definitions of put in, if you look it up, is to imagine yourself in a place. So in this version of the solve, in this layer of the solve, put in below the Homa Brown means to imagine ourselves at this location and what we would see from this location. So let's say let's go on the street view here and let's look at what we'd see. So first of all, we know that we would put in below the Homa Brown. Well, here we are right on the corner below the fishing shop, the fly shop. And if I take you over to, just for fun, I'm going to take you over to the forward for in Too Far to Walk. And Forrest talks about how he went fishing down the Madison River. And at the very end, he says, for me now, it's just too far to walk. And then he has a picture of a fly right here. So in that part of the poem, not far but too far to walk, put in below the Homa Brown, we're literally right here below a fly shop and a fishing store. It even says fish pond right here, right? So now we should be able to find other things associated with the poem here. So from there, it's no place for the meek. Well, let's turn around. And what do we have on the other side of the road but the Wild West Express? I would certainly consider that no place for the meek. The end is ever drawing nigh. Down the road from here, you have the Dude Motel that has the little cowboy on top drawing his gun. Forrest owned this motel. He talks about it in Too Far to Walk in chapter 19. He talks about owning this motel, I think back in the 60s or 70s. And if we go to that motel, let's look at it on the above view. And if you come down to it, the Dude Roundup Motel, let's just go into it and look at some of the pictures here. We get a better view of the dude on the sign. You can see he's sitting there holding his holster, basically drawing his gun. So the end is ever drawing nigh. By the way, this is on the corner of Boundary Street and Madison Avenue. So Boundary Street is the end, and ever drawing nigh is the guy holding his gun, drawing his gun. So let's go back to our spot. So from there, it's no place for the meek. The end is ever drawing nigh. There'll be no paddle up your creek. Well, we're standing here on Canyon Street. We see a sign here at the fishing shop for float trips. We also know that Forrest referred to Canyon Street as having deep potholes and filled with water, kind of giving the impression of this like being kind of imagined as a creek. Just heavy loads in water high. He had his paper route up and down Canyon Street, where he carried what he referred to as the heavy paper bag that was too big for him, that made him tired. So that's your heavy loads. And then the water high could be either the deep potholes in Canyon Street. It could also be the deep kettles he referred to from the Totem Cafe, which were up the street here. So either way, there's solutions in the book that explain that. And if you want to find physical things that represent those as well, you got the heavy loads in right here at the Bullwinkle restaurant here, which is also part of what the Totem Cafe used to be. If we go into their pictures here, you see that they have a train that runs through the so you have a train that runs through the inside of the restaurant. I don't know how old that is, but I know all these places were there before Forrest did the poem. So that could be your heavy loads if we're trying to make it consistent with the Haynes Mountain reference to the railroad workers that and all that. And then the water high could just as easily be, you have another restaurant right here. It's called the Slippery Otter Pub. And they also have if you look at their signs they have an otter up on the sign in the water, and that's water high, like literally up high on the roof. Now, I kind of like more just sticking to the book for this part of it, but certainly, if you wanted to have physical references to those clues, you could find them as well. So now we're back at our street corner, and we need to have been wise and found the blaze. So let's go back down here. Let's look across the street. We see that orange roof right there. Now, what is that building? Let's go back over to it. So this is the Madison Crossing Lounge. So I looked up on their website and giving the background of it. So this is the Madison Crossing Lounge. And this building was constructed in 1918. It was the first West Yellowstone school. And it talks about how the Madison Lounge, the Madison Crossing Lounge is in the former first grade classroom. There's a chapter in Forrest's book called First Grade where his dad puts a sign out in front of the school that says Mr. Fenn Principal. And we have a sign in front of this building that says Madison Crossing Lounge. And so if we go back to 9 Mile Hole now that we've completed that stanza of the poem in this location, let's go back to 9 Mile Hole where we have found the blaze, but we've also been wise. And the reason we've been wise is because in the second layer of the poem, we stood there on the corner of Madison and Canyon, and we saw the school, which has the sign that says Madison Crossing. In other words, that sign in the second layer is literally telling us what we're about to do. We're going to cross the Madison. We've been wise. We know we're going to cross the Madison. We've found the blaze because we're already at 9 Mile Hole. Now we look quickly down on our map, and we look to the end of the poem now to know what to do next. But since we're looking quickly down, we can draw our line down on our map towards the treasure that we now exist there. And we look down in the poem now to get our final instructions. So now we're going to proceed to the final stanza of the poem. And so let's go back through our presentation here. So the final stanza, worth the cold. Hear me all and listen good. So if we're waiting for like our final instructions from the blaze, it's pretty apparent from the wording here that, hey, I'm going to give you your final clues now, so hear me all and listen good. Your effort will be worth the cold. So now we're switching from past tense to future tense. So if we had already crossed the Madison at this point, then why will our effort be worth the cold? We had been wise, we found the blaze past tense, and then we look quickly down for our final instructions, and it's telling us future tense that our effort will be worth the cold. In other words, now is our instruction to take everything we know, Madison Crossing, look quickly down. Now we're going to enter the cold. We're going to enter the water, cross the river. And then cold also is a reference to Frosty, Forrest's boss who pointed at him on the tree. Frosty was referred to as the ruler at the Totem Cafe. So we go to the spot where the Totem Cafe happened, where the very event in this picture happened, right at the corner of Madison and Canyon. And Frosty, our ruler, is pointing at Forrest under a tree holding his pie. And that's why this line that we drew from Madison Junction to the junction of Madison and Canyon Street makes sense, because we're literally copying this representation in the book. Our effort is worth the cold. We are pointing from where Frosty did this to Madison Junction, and that line is going to tell us where the treasure is. That intersection between our blaze line and then the line that came across from West Yellowstone over to Madison Junction is going to intersect right here at the chest. That's your X marks the spot. That's the final location. That's your precision. That's how Forrest knew that if you solved the poem, it would take you right to the spot. He didn't say it would take you to this giant, mangly forest you had to try to turn upside down or burn to the ground to find the chest. He told you it would take you right to the spot. And I think it's possible this might be how he intended to do it. So one more addendum I forgot to add, giving a little bit more potential meaning to brave and in the wood. So, brave and in the wood, if you are brave and in the wood, I give you title to the gold. That's the final line of the poem. Certainly, Braven in the Wood could be another reference to the Totem Cafe. You know, a totem pole being like a wooden staff that's carved, you know, by Indians. So like a brave Indian and the making a totem pole. That could be it. It's just giving more of a push, more pushing us more towards that Totem Cafe chapter. Another thing it could be, and this one I'm like not as certain on, but I still think it's a fun one to bring up. So let's go back to our street view from the corner here, and there's the Playmill Theater here. So if we go to the Playmill Theater, they give us a history of all the plays they've done. Let's see if I can find it. So I found it before, now I can't find it. I think we go to like Playmill History. Here we go. And it shows you like the plays they've done every year. And one of them caught my eye, and you're going to see why really quick. So in 1999, now no significance to this year whatsoever. So like I said, this is a long shot. But Brave and in the Woods. Here in 1999, they did a play called Into the Woods. But obviously we don't see any other connection to that line until you look up the definition of brave. Definition 1 is the classic definition of brave, like showing courage and danger and all that. Definition number 2 is making a fine show, colorful. Well, what was the other play? It was Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, colorful, brave, into the woods. So brave and in the wood. Now this would be so deep down the rabbit hole, it's hard to believe this would ever be part of the poem. But if we're looking for like another layer of meaning to connecting this street corner to everything going on over at 9 Mile Hole, that could be what he meant, as crazy as it sounds. So I just wanted to add that in, but ultimately, you know, whether that's truly significant to this idea being truthful or not, I don't think it is. But I don't know, let me know what you think about all this. What parts of this you like, what parts you don't like, maybe you hated all of it. But hey, I'm out here looking for solutions. I want to give myself and the community a little bit more closure and a little bit more than anything, satisfaction with what Forrest might have intended to do with this book and this poem and leading that smart finder all the way to the chest. So that's that.